First this morning, the National Union of Teachers has told this programme it wants action from the new government to tackle what it calls the scourge of asbestos in schools in England. Asbestos was widely used in buildings in the past and was banned in 1999, but it is still in many schools. Growing numbers of people are dying from mesothelioma, a rare and incurable form of cancer, usually of the lung, caused by exposure to asbestos. Between 2003 and 2012, nearly 22,000 people in the UK died from this cancer, amongst them teachers. While the deaths of people in teaching jobs are no higher than those in other occupations, the union says it's a scandal that asbestos remains in our schools. Our reporter Nicola Beckford has been talking to people affected by the disease.
I can't walk very far because I get out of breath. We don't go abroad. We used to go abroad every school holidays. We tend to go in England.
The blueberry bush first?
Yes, blueberry, here.
Jenny has mesothelioma, a form of cancer.
Okay.
Treatable but not curable and increasingly debilitating.
Yep, just wait a moment. Sometimes I cry because I just feel it goes on and on and on. Yep, yep. But I'm fairly upbeat.
Oh dear.
Mesothelioma deaths have risen in the last 40 years. The disease mostly affects people whose jobs exposed them to asbestos when it was widely used in the building industry, but other people get it too.
I worked as a science teacher. I loved the things around us and the living things.
There we go.
The things around us, I think they're absolutely fantastic. And I always noticed everything. Look at the bees on there.
I know, they're busy,
yes,
aren't
very busy.
Yeah.
Jenny believes she was exposed to asbestos while she was a science teacher,
Yes,
but
yes.
doesn't know exactly how.
Yeah, so if I move that tray...
It was in lab equipment and also in buildings she taught in.
Okay. Brilliant.
Good idea.
Brilliant, yeah. I think it was in the ceilings, and I presume they were in the walls as well. Great. So when the tiles came off, the asbestos would come down.
Why were the tiles coming off the ceiling?
Because it was damp, very, very damp.
How often would you be picking the tiles up and putting them back?
Almost every day. Move that up a bit.
Well, it needs levelling.
Yes.
Years later, she knows she has limited time.
Okay. Today is good, but on a bad day, I just feel like staying in bed. And that's where I stay.
That was your 70th, wasn't it?
Yes, yes.
That's,
70.
Look,
Jenny is hoping that chemotherapy has slowed down the disease. A drug trial is the only other option.
that was the husky in Norway. And
She's one of a number of former teachers with mesothelioma who've been awarded compensation. Her lawyers say the local authority that employed her settled the claim with no admission of liability.
I don't have any hopes at all, but I fear not knowing how I'm going to react when I'm dying. It doesn't matter how terrible it is, as long as I know what's going to happen.
And Bromley, listening to Jenny talk like that, how does that make you feel?
sad. Sort of, it's coming to an end. We we know we're on borrowed time.
Things are very different now. If schools have asbestos in their buildings, there are strict regulations about how to manage it to make sure it's safe. This involves measures like creating an asbestos register and monitoring its condition. Employers also need to inform and train any staff that might disturb it. Staff and contractors need to know where the asbestos is. And in this school, every measure is in place to ensure that it is absolutely safe.
Good morning. That's a bright and breezy good morning for Monday morning. I've been reading a book. The buildings go back to the sort of mid-50s when the school first became into existence. But there was a catastrophic fire in the early 90s, which resulted in most, but not all, of the buildings being replaced. So much of what you see around would be judged pretty new buildings. The ones that aren't were those that survived the fire, which include the two sets of, we call them huts, but the temporary buildings which are on the playground.
So this is where the asbestos is in the school?
It's where some of it is, yes, and these are the oldest classrooms in the school, and so the building techniques that we used in those days involved the use of some asbestos, but it is very carefully managed. And the wording's very clear here. Do not make any cutting or fixing without authority and proper precautions. So we're satisfied that this doesn't present a risk to the people who learn and work in this part of the building. We have an asbestos log which explains in very, very great detail of where we've got the asbestos within the buildings, and that's managed by our site manager, and he works very closely with the asset managers who come in and advise.
He wants to see the dilapidated huts removed altogether, but hasn't had the funding.
We tried to get money to replace the buildings completely, and we were motivated to do that because they really aren't fit for purpose in our judgment. Certainly not for the kind of expectations we have of our children.
Even if there is no significant risk, is it right that asbestos should still be in schools?
Well, I don't think it is. But we do have to operate within the guidelines and the guidance that schools have to take notice of these days. The idea that it is all dealt with, gone, taken away is a fantastic idea, actually, and it would sort all kinds of things out for us. And as a school and as a community, we're trying very hard to effect that. But in the meantime, we do have to work around the guidelines that tell us that, you know, our buildings are safe for children to learn in and safe for people to work in.
This school is far from unique. In fact, lots of schools in England contained some asbestos. It was banned in 1999, but it was used widely in lots of buildings, including schools, between 1945 and 1975. And there are concerns about the possible link between this and mesothelioma cases. It's estimated that more than 3/4 of schools in England have some asbestos.
Between 2003 and 2012, nearly 22,000 people died of mesothelioma in Great Britain. 224 of those deaths were people whose last occupation was recorded as teaching professionals. It can take decades for the disease to develop. It isn't possible to say whether deaths of former teachers has any link with their work. And mesothelioma deaths of people who are in teaching-related occupations are not higher than in other jobs. But the National Union of Teachers is calling for action from the new government and a long-term strategy to tackle asbestos in schools. It wants to see it all removed eventually, starting with asbestos in the worst condition. A recent government review maintained that if asbestos is undamaged and managed safely, it doesn't pose a risk, and that it's safer to keep it in place. Where there's a risk the asbestos might be disturbed, it should be made safe. Where it's damaged or building work needs doing, it should be taken out.
I've always had motorbikes since I was 16, still do. That's not one of the things I've had to give up. I keep thinking one day I should sort of get fed up, but I never do. Every year when the sun comes out, you get that little feeling you want to get out there, and I love it.
When he was younger, David worked as a joiner. He later became a woodwork teacher.
I was aware of what asbestos was in there and where it was. We were told it was all either sealed or we knew where it was, and we weren't allowed to do anything near it or touch it, and we thought we were okay.
He then worked as a technician at the same school. He thought he knew the risks of asbestos.
We used to remove ceiling tiles and put them back, but then of course the whole ceiling void is wide open, so you're not in a room where there's asbestos, but that could be drifting across. I was unaware that I was at any risk whatsoever from the actual asbestos, as long as I didn't directly drill into it or disturb it.
He was diagnosed with mesothelioma 3 years ago.
All sorts of horrible things come through your mind that you'd not really thought of.
Thank you.
Everything comes at you like a bombshell. You're going to die the next day, but of course you don't. And straight away,
Last year, David was awarded compensation by the local authority that used to employ him. His lawyers say liability was admitted over his exposure to asbestos while he was a technician.
One of my main concerns is Maggie's quite a bit younger than me. Is she going to have to, at 60-year-old, find a job? So that worried me a little bit. When we received the compensation, that then takes that weight off your mind.
But of course, you'd rather not have them.
They can have it back tomorrow, with pleasure.
Jamie, though, do you like school?
The day that he got his diagnosis, I remember sitting in the waiting room for 45 minutes. I think it was the longest 45 minutes of my life. And until they actually said the words, I think we thought that they were just going to say, no, everything's all right. But when they actually say it, I think my overwhelming feeling was that I needed to be strong. But I suppose it's difficult to do that.
No, Ethan.
We all cried.
Yeah, we all did, yeah.
And I think coming back in the car, I remember coming back in the car, I think we were all just in shock.
Good sandwich.
Paul's mesothelioma was discovered nearly 3 years ago when he was 34. Chemotherapy and a major operation have stopped the progression of the illness, for now.
Count them.
Do you ever allow yourself to think about a time when Paul isn't here?
Maybe briefly. I think really that I have to stay positive for them now. Obviously it has crossed my mind that what will happen when he's not here, but I think I need to live now, for the time now, and not what might be in the future.
Can you speak normally, please? I can. Yes, you can, silly.
Rates are highest in men over 75 and those whose jobs exposed them directly to asbestos before the 1980s. Regulations about managing asbestos in buildings are much more rigorous today. Paul's diagnosis at such a young age means he was probably exposed to asbestos as a child. He has asked lawyers to investigate.
I've never worked with asbestos, so in my mind, I don't know where I got it from. There's two possibilities, possibly from school or possibly from my father, because he worked at an agricultural company. But again, I don't know.
Oh, well done. Well done. Right, get trains out then.
I get very angry at times because I feel like I've lost my life. I've lost my son, seeing my son grow up.
You take him.
Some days I forget I have this disease. Some days I sit here and I think I feel as normal as anything. But there are days where I sit and think, what's it going to be like? Am I going to be able to cope? And I'll just take it as it comes. When it comes, it comes. There's nothing I can do about it. It will come when it's ready. You know, at the moment, I'm enjoying life as much as I can. I will fight it, and I will do everything in my power that I can do. Yeah, it does scare me, but I have come to terms with it. And then you take him past. That's it.
The government says it will continue to invest to ensure that asbestos is managed safely and to reduce the amount there is in schools. Paul is adamant There should be no compromise.
We need prevention, we need more information on this, about what asbestos does, what it can do. You know, that it is a dangerous substance, that it needs to be taken out of buildings and schools to stop people like me getting this disease and having their life taken from them.
Nicola Beckford reporting, and if you want to share that film, you can find it on our programme page, bbc.co.uk/Victoria, or read more about it on the BBC News site. Thank you for your comments, by the way. This viewer has texted, in the last year, our school has lost 2 teachers to this asbestos cancer, yet our school will not or cannot tell students who might be affected. Phoebe on Twitter says asbestos puts school pupils and staff lives at risk. It's a terrible illness. Steps need to be taken to prevent more suffering. And Simon on Twitter says, yes, teachers are affected, but builders and Royal Navy personnel, too many submariners are struck down. We'll have more on that story later on. And that report put together by Nicola Beckford. Let's talk now to Chris Wallace, who has the cancer linked to asbestos. Also Sarah Lyons, the Health and Safety Officer for the National Union of Teachers. Professor Julian Pito is here, Professor of Cancer and Epidemiology at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and Jonathan Francis, an asbestos consultant. Welcome all of you. Chris, when you were diagnosed, what made you suspect it was linked to asbestos?
When I was finally diagnosed, and I was told I had mesothelioma, I was actually told then by the consultant that the only thing that caused this was exposure to asbestos.
Could that not have happened while you were working in the building trade?
Due to the nature of the disease and the time it takes from being exposed to diagnosed, being around 20-25 years, that time frame put me straight back in primary school / secondary school. So the construction was too close to diagnose.
Right. Sarah Lyons, the government have recently published new guidance to make sure people in schools who are responsible for managing asbestos do it safely, responsibly, and have the skills to do it safely and responsibly. Why is that not enough for you?
Well, we do welcome the publication of that guidance and the fact that the Department for Education undertook a review into its policy on asbestos in schools, but we don't think that review went far enough. They haven't set out a long-term strategy for removal, and there's no plans to do a national audit of the type, condition and extent of asbestos in schools.
So you, in the end, you want it all removed over a period of time, a phased removal, if you like?
Yes, we accept it can't happen overnight. We accept it's expensive, but we see no reason why there can't be a strategic plan for removal, focusing on the asbestos in the worst condition, first of all.
They say, the government say, nothing is more important than the health and safety of children and staff in our schools, and since 2010 we've invested billions to improve the condition of the school estate, with more to come.
Well, some schools will be having their asbestos removed as part of the Priority Schools building programme, but it's still a relatively small number of schools that will be affected, less than 300. And the most recent estimate is that 86% of schools contain asbestos, so there's obviously a long way to go.
That sounds like a really alarming figure. 86% of schools contain asbestos. Professor Peter, what is the risk to teachers and children?
Well, we don't know accurately because it's completely impossible to measure the actual asbestos levels that people are breathing in. What we've been doing is looking at how much asbestos people have in their lungs, and what we've seen is that there's been 100-fold or possibly more than 100-fold reduction from people my age. I was born in 1945, and the average Englishman my age has about 100,000 asbestos fibres per gram of lung now. So that's after, sort of 50 years later. And people born in the 1980s and more recently have 100 times or more than 100 times less than that. So we know that, and that's nothing to do with asbestos in schools. I mean, that's just the amount of asbestos that the average person has in their lung.
Right.
And so we expect the risk to go down more or less in proportion. So, I mean, the mesothelioma risk to men my age is almost 1%. I mean, it's about 1 in 150 men my age in Britain are going to die of mesothelioma. It's an extraordinary statistic, I think. But that's likely to go down to, of the order of, less than 1 in 10,000 for people born more recently.
Are teachers and pupils at more risk than anybody in any other profession?
Well, everyone's a pupil. That's the point. I mean, I think that the concern over asbestos in schools, I don't think is so much to do with teachers, it's to do with children, because the way mesothelioma works is that once you're exposed to asbestos, your risk goes up very, very rapidly with time. And it's trivial for the first 30 years. I mean, there are very, very few cases within 30 years of exposure. And the longer the time that passes, the higher the risk. And so the peak rates are above age 85 and 90, and the risk is still going up.
Right. But Jonathan Francis, to be exposed to it in schools, does it have to be disrupted or moved, or can it be managed safely?
It can be managed safely.
Which is what the government say they're doing.
It can be, and we represent a number of asbestos removal contractors and consultants who do the air testing and surveys, and we're still finding that a lot of schools aren't managing it properly. The most important thing is to get a proper asbestos survey. Then from that you find out the condition of the asbestos, and then the likelihood of it being damaged, the risks associated with that, and then you can make a decision on whether you encapsulate it or remove it. As long as it's in good condition and it's monitored, then it's fine. But you've also got to make sure that when people are coming into the school and the pupils and the staff aren't damaging it, so putting pins in boards, plumbers and electricians know where it is and don't drill through it or damage it further. So it's a good survey and the right survey, the most important things.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming in. Thank you. Thanks for your time. Thank you very much.